Hi, welcome to the Ellis Talker Show. I'm DV LeBron. Do you have any construction needs around your house? Maybe you have some roofing needs. Check out our local K&H Contracting. They can help you with any of those remodeling needs or roofing needs. He's a local company. He's a local guy, grew up in Waxahachie, and would love to help you. Reach out to K&H Contracting. So today, my very special guest, who I am so glad to have on, who is a award-winning author and a Timberwolf pup, Becky Ellis. How are you doing, ma'am?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
So there's a whole bunch of things that I want to cover on the show, but you wrote the book Little Avalanches. And why I think that is so important is because as a veteran with PTSD and a veteran that had a dad who was a veteran, a Vietnam vet, and having the things of his life and him dealing with PTSD, how they affected him. And unfortunately, how my PTSD affected my family, fatherhood, being a husband, and every other thing. You capture it in this book. And I'm like so grateful that somebody is talking about it. So thank you so much for coming on the show, ma'am.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. And it is unique. The book is unique in that the voices of children are strikingly absent from the war narrative. And that is what I wanted to do in this book is give voice to the children and the families of veterans and also voice to the veterans themselves. But to
When
definitely add that in of the children and families.
And I'm very grateful that you are covering that you did a book on that. I got about 100 books, none of them that have gotten past concept, but the concept's been in my head. Maybe one day I'll actually write it. But I'd like for you to introduce yourself for my audience, and then we'll dig in.
I call myself a Timberwolf pup because all of the descendants of the Timberwolves, which is the nickname for the 104th Infantry, we are all Timberwolf pups. So that means I am the daughter of a World War II combat veteran, and my dad was a rifleman in the 104th. So that means his unit crossed the front lines first. And his unit in particular had a 300% casualty rate. So my father saw a lot of trauma and had a really tough time. He was on the battlefield for 172 consecutive days. And the
Mhm.
Timberwolves were out there for 195 days, which is the longest period of consecutive battle in World War II for an infantry division.
Yeah, this guy, I saw nothing like him. I did not have an experience like that. And you get into that in the book. But you start off on this book on Little Avalanches, and I highly recommend to read. You start off on this book, you start off a story of a daughter trying to be dutiful to her dad, a dad
Right.
that has some very interesting issues. You were young, and him and your mom that didn't work out. And then he's got some hippie girlfriend next, and I don't know if he married her, I can't remember. And
Yes.
then he ups and takes off with a girl half his age, and then that's stepmom, and you got to deal with that. So there's so many choices that he's making along the way, but I don't want to spoil it. Talk to me about what inspired you to write this book, and what were you trying to capture in those first few chapters?
I wanted the reader to experience the life that I experienced as the child of a veteran. My father didn't talk about the war, like many veterans don't talk about the war and live behind a veil of silence. My dad didn't talk about 5 years ago or 5 minutes ago. He was always moving forward, which is how he survived battle. He told me, "You cannot look backwards on the battlefield or you will not live. You have to be always running forward." So I wanted the reader to see what it was like for a child and a family to live with a veteran who has PTSD, who is being motivated by what he learned in surviving war to how he practiced surviving life without understanding who he was, because I didn't understand who he was.
Yeah.
And then, so the first part is my childhood with this father, and most readers despise my father by the end of part one. But
I
then,
I
go
understood your
ahead.
dad. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
understood.
No, I'm
I,
glad.
I understood him. I'm not making excuses for him. I thought along with, man, what the hell is this guy thinking? But I remember in the deepest parts of my fog, in the darkest moments of my trauma and dealing with that, learning how to live with life after, I wasn't a good man at all. And so I was like, I was looking at myself, and it was a powerful experience. But he take me through this dental procedure. Like I was reading through this and I was like, she did what? He did. Please
Yeah.
tell me through that. Please take me through that.
My dad wanted us to be tough as old nails and prepared. And later in his life, when we finally talked, he was 89 years old before he finally spoke to me about the war. And when he did, I was able to ask him some of those questions like, Dad, why would you have me have my teeth drilled without Novocaine? Which is what he did. And he did a lot of things to try to toughen us up and prepare us, but prepared for what? We didn't know. And he told me later on that he wanted to prove to himself that we would survive. If he was going to love somebody, he wanted to make sure they would survive. So he continued to put our family in dangerous situations and toughened my siblings and I up so that we would survive whatever we were confronted with. And that was his whatever complicated, complex PTSD response to wanting to make sure his family was safe and protected, was to put us into dangerous situations, which
Becky,
sounds
it sounds
unreasonable,
crazy.
but that's what it was.
Becky, tell me that last name again. His last
Boswell.
name, Boswell. Okay,
Yeah.
so he wanted you to be a Boswell. And the crazy thing was, you were trying to be a Boswell. You were, hey, I'm going to live up to that name, Dad, which is something I did for my Marine Corps Vietnam dad. I wanted to be a LeBron so bad, no matter what that meant, no matter what that looked like, because my dad was the biggest, baddest former Marine Vietnam vet. My dad was the toughest, greatest thing ever. And I wanted to be just like him. And I remember that there were so many things that happened along that journey with him when he was home, because like a lot of Vietnam vets, he got hooked on a needle and he never
Mm.
quite got off that needle, and then made some really piss poor choices, ended up in prison, and the story goes on and on. But there was a lot in that, in your story, that I saw in Dad's story. He couldn't get right. He never really told me his story. So the fact that you got the story from
Mm.
your dad is crazy. But there's a chapter in your book where you're doing this and it's showing all this stuff, and your dad used the word that probably would get somebody canceled nowadays. His word that you kept saying was hysterical. Whenever any woman, it seemed like in the story, when any woman had anything to say, it was hysterical, including you. You
Yeah.
even got the hysterics, and everything was hysterical, which was a generational thing. That was actual thing,
Yep.
generational thing. But he went with hysterical for everything. But there was what was it? The silver wings. I could have it wrong, but you had a chapter in there with the wings,
Full of wings, it's
the
called.
sizzle of wings. In this chapter, you finally say no, and it was an argument between that your dad was having, and he was calling your mom a bitch, and you were like, stop doing that. And you stood up to this man who was your hero, who you wanted to be like, who you took pain without Novocaine, you got your teeth done, and you described getting your teeth grinded because you wanted to be a Boswell Raw. So this man's your hero, and all of a sudden you have to stand up to him. And tell me about that experience, and tell me what you wanted to bring out in that section of the book.
Like all children, we I wanted my father to love me, and I wanted to be loved by my father. Whether your parent is a veteran or not, we want to be loved, and we want our parents to be proud of us. And we need them to love us actually to survive, right? We need them to take
Mhm.
care of us and to love us and all that. And in the chapter The Sizzle of Wings, it's a metaphor. The chapter a little bit is a metaphor for flying into for moths that flew into the Coleman lantern that we had on our boat, and they would fly into the lantern and they would stick to the hot glass. They'd
Mhm.
fly into the light and they would die because it was too hot. And that was what being around my father was like. If you got too close, you got burned. You would
Mhm. Yeah.
essentially vaporize. He did that to people. And it's not that he was a bad guy, he was suffering. And so we were all suffering. And the chapter is there to show that at some point in time, I stood up to him because my mother, who he had divorced several years before, was suffering too. And he would call her bad names. And I had enough of it as a child. And I was one of the only people that would actually stand up to my dad. And I finally said, enough. If you do this one more time, I'm not ever seeing you again. And it was my effort to set a boundary as a child. But of course, that doesn't work. And what I
Mm.
wanted to show is I wanted to have control of my life, but there was no possible way I was ever going to have control of my childhood. And of course, I don't want to give the story away, but it doesn't work. Me saying I'll never visit you again. First of all, my dad, the threat I make, he just acts as if I haven't even said anything, which he did all the time.
You
You know,
did.
my voice was silenced always by being ignored.
Mhm.
And then, of course, I didn't win the battle. I just drug my mom into a battle with me, and that made me feel even worse.
Martin
Martin
tried to
tried to
say
tell me. Yeah,
he
my
tried to
older
tell you.
brother.
He
He
tried to
did.
tell you, and because he saw it. He saw, I don't know, maybe, and I'm just going off the story, maybe real life was a little bit, but it's like he knew you're gonna be talking to a wall, sis. You're
Yeah.
just it's gonna cause more trouble than it's worth. There was no breaking through, is what I think how he saw it. So why try?
Yeah. He wanted everybody just to be okay. We wanted the same thing. He just went about it differently than I did because I think he was a year older, but probably a decade wiser. And he knew that we didn't have the power to change my father. He seemed to always know that, and I don't know if it's was his gender. My dad treated him a little bit differently than he treated me. He was a little bit harder on my brother, um, and he was just wiser than I was. He could just
Mhm.
see things more clearly than I could.
My dad had episodes where, and they were drug induced, but he had episodes where Vietnam would flash back. And I remember being at a hotel and he was flashing back on top of the hotel on a drug thing, and we were there with him. And I remember him on the roof and my mom trying to keep him from killing himself. And then
Mm,
us begging him not to do it. And we were kids. We were, well,
yeah.
I want to say we were 6, maybe.
I'm
We
sorry.
it's a it was a rough life. And
That's hard.
the thing was that with us is the situation started off really bad. We had to run to New York. In New York, he gets wrapped up in drugs, gets wrapped up in things, goes to prison. My mom, who had accompanied him to New York, had a 10th grade education. She knew no English. And while Puerto Ricans are Americans, there's a language barrier. And she didn't know a lick of English. And she had to fend for 2 little boys in New York in the 80s before there was any of the stuff, the safety nets, the stuff. No, she had to work sweatshops because of my
Mm,
dad's decisions. All that fantasy jewelry that was out in the 80s, that was my mom making it in a sweatshop. And so
right.
his decisions affected us, and it was traumatic. There was traumatic experiences where my dad freaking out and with the gun is my dad would always ran around with the gun.
Yeah.
And the thing was that later I became him.
Yeah. I'm
And so
sorry.
I,
In many ways, I became my father. Not in those same ways, but in many ways, I also became my father. We do become our parents. And one reason I wanted to write this book is because it's not just to give voice to children in the war narrative, but it was for people like you and for other veteran families who might see themselves in the pages and have a mirror for, oh, yes, this happened to me too. And not all veteran families are like this, but many are. And one thing for sure is their secrecy. Veteran Veterans don't talk about their experience with civilians, and veteran families learn the silence and they don't talk about their experience with civilians. And I wrote it not only for veterans, but for civilians too, because I believe that military service is not a few years of sacrifice. It is a lifetime of sacrifice. I believe our military service members trade a normal life for a life that they could not have imagined. And it
Yeah.
doesn't only affect them, it affects their families for generations
Before I
because
talk,
we
yeah,
become
um,
like our parents in whatever way we're going to be like them.
yes, before I go into that, because I definitely want to go into that, I don't want to skip through and without giving too much of the book. I just enjoyed it so much that I'm like, ooh, I got about 30 minutes left, folks. I'm gonna be all over it. But so she has this the sizzle wing thing, and then it goes to her calling him out, like, what happened? And he's, you really want to ruin my day? And takes off on her, ignores her, like she said. And then next thing you know, some guy comes on there and he's narrating the story. Now, her dad, he won a silver star for bravery. So he was being attacked and his guys were being attacked. They were getting wiped out and they had to swim through, they had to get through a river to live. If they didn't get through that river, the Germans would kill every one of them. And so some of those guys was like, no, I'm not swimming. And which I don't understand, because if I was getting shot at, and I understand the experience of getting shot at, I would be Michael Phelps. So I would be a swimming fool, but they couldn't swim. Your dad, under fire, decides, hey, I'm going to go get the only boat, because they had destroyed all the other boats. So he found the only boat, went in front of fire, grabbed that boat, brought it over so he could get these dudes over under heavy fire. And I was like, wow, it starts going into his story. Like it's a 195 total for his unit. And then I forget the other number, 170 something that you had said with him, that he was there. And he talks about the realities of war. But the thing is that Becky writes the book as descriptive as his memoirs describe, as descriptive as the war is. So she describes something where you get into the story and then that section describes it. I don't know if he wrote it, you wrote it. I don't know if he added or, but whatever it is, you go into the mind of a soldier and it's like day 50, man, today sucked. Day, what is it? Day 51, cold, really freaking cold. Day 52. And the realities of what war was being captured. He talks about, guys, I don't want to get close to anybody. Why am I going to get
Mhm.
close to anybody? They were dying. They were dying like crazy. So while we worked as a unit, we weren't chummy because I know that this guy was going to catch a bullet. And then he talked about your dad. He goes in there. They have to save these guys that are stuck in a foxhole. It's almost a whole platoon or something. They're
Yeah.
stuck in a foxhole. And your dad, who hadn't eaten, he has the dude barely ate. When he got into a certain area, the Germans actually tried to poison them with the food that they gave them. So he had to go. He was so hungry, he took a bite out of a sandwich just because he was starving and had to spit it out. And then he's saving these dudes. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. This dude seen it all.
Guys were literally freezing to death. That's
Yeah,
how a lot of the casualties happened.
and
And
it's
my
like you go
dad
into,
said they would, yeah, and my dad said they would come around and check people's feet. My dad refused to unlace his boots because he said he didn't want some kid hacking his feet off. That's how it was. A lot of men got their feet amputated from because they froze and got trench foot. So, but that section of the book, it's part two. So part one is my childhood, and part two is a journal of my father's experience on the battlefield. And it is war without glory. It is the
oh,
story
that was
from the trenches, and it's how he felt and what he saw, and it's the truth of war. And he did not write it, but when he started talking to me, I at first took notes, but then I started recording him, and I had over 26 hours of him recording. And he started talking to me when he was 89. And for the next 7 years, he talked about the war with me. Once he opened up, a valve opened, and he did not stop talking about it. And so all of that came from him. When I got his whole story, I wrote it all down, and it was 300 pages. And that is reduced into about 42 pages in the book because it's plenty for a reader to handle. It is fast paced. It is accelerated heart rate. I had one World War II history buff say it was the scariest war story he'd ever read.
there was no
So,
glory, there was no raw,
mhm.
there was no happy endings. It was like it really took you through war as it is.
And
Grateful.
that's the story I wanted to tell because I tried to watch a lot of movies so I could understand my father, and most of the war movies have some type of a happy ending. Even Band of Brothers that I thought, "Okay, they're doing a pretty good job," and then they make it seem like everybody goes home and they're gonna live this happy life, and that was not the case for my father or any other veteran families that I knew, and I've heard a lot of veterans say the real battle started when they came home and they had to live with themselves alone.
A and it
And
did. Going into that, the real battle, I've lost so many friends that couldn't live with the war after the war,
y
couldn't live with the things that happened, and so decided that putting a gun in their mouth was the best solution, and
yes,
I'm not here because I didn't try. I'm here because of the grace of God. For me, it was God. For people, hey, get there how you get there, brothers, sisters. I don't care how you get there. For me, it was God. That's what works for me. It may not be you because I tried everything else,
right.
and whether it was women, whether it was alcohol, whether it was whatever it was, nothing filled the hole that I had in here. My wife and this beautiful lady at the VA were the ones who point. My wife, first of all, she pointed out that there was an issue because she was like, hey, you might need some look at something. I'm like, I don't need that. That ain't for me. I don't need that. I don't need that. And so, uh, just getting the help was because of my wife explaining to me how the brain fires when you have PTSD, when you've gone through war, compared to how it fires when you haven't, like
Mhm.
neurotypical firing of the brain. So she's looking this up, and she is my hero. She's my hero
Oh,
because
that
she was the one who she was the one who was who she's the one. And then
we all need a hero.
the lady is that lady in the VA who she helped me to talk about the story. And once I was able to tell it as a story, once I was able to disconnect from it and actually tell it because it needed to be said, now I have no qualms about my story. I don't care if it makes somebody uncomfortable. I don't care. It is my story. And I tell it not for my glory. I tell it for God's glory. Or maybe a veteran will hear it and say, you know what, brother, if you can do it, I can do that too.
I've
So
talked to a lot of veterans, and they don't wanna tell their stories, and I've asked them why, and one said to me, not just one, but a few have said, "You think you can understand what I went through?" And I've said, "No, actually, I don't think I will ever fully understand what any veteran has gone through, especially a combat veteran, but I will try. I will sit here and I will try." And the healing happens when I feel you feeling me. And if I can feel a veteran when he's telling me his story, I know a healing is happening. And
yes,
that's what happened for my dad and I. And while his war story does not have a happy ending, I want to just say that the book has a happy ending because it when my father and I were finally able to talk and he was finally able to tell me his story, I could understand him and I could see who he really was. And in
yes,
seeing him, I could see who I was and who I had become. And veterans need to tell their stories for that reason too, so their children can understand not only their veteran parent, but themselves. Because I understand myself now that I understand my father. And that is the true gift that he gave me. And
that's
in
beautiful.
that, he is my hero too for
Yeah.
doing that for me.
He's my hero too for what he went through because I know veterans from different ages. We're different. We've served different wars. We've done different things. Before I start closing, because I'm loving this conversation. Talk to me about that part about intergenerational trauma. How did you get through it? What are some of the things that you've seen successful for a veteran and their families to get through because their families go through it too? And you
Mm.
went through it. You went through his trauma. I went through my dad's trauma. My kids went through my trauma. Can you talk on that?
Yeah, children experience secondary trauma when their parent experiences trauma and can't articulate it, and they act out on it. But then when they act out on that trauma and it affects their children, then their children experience trauma as well. And that is how trauma is passed through generations. If the parent can articulate it and talk about it and make meaning out of it, then everybody can understand it. And it doesn't necessarily become a trauma point or a traumatized experience. Then we can understand it. And even though I didn't understand my father, didn't know what he went through because he wouldn't talk about it, I carried his pain because I felt his pain. I felt him struggling. And we all struggled because we felt him struggling and we carried that. And we carried that forward. And I have 3 daughters of my own, and I thought I was raising them very different than I was raised. And having seen myself after my father opened up to me, I realized, oh, I am actually like my father in these certain ways, and I can do better. I don't need to pass this on to my children. And so I've had a lot of conversations with my own kids now. And I was super strict with my kids on drugs and alcohol. And when you read the book, you realize why I might have been that way. My little sister got drunk on my dad's boat. And when my siblings and I all get together, we do what siblings do and we say, oh, remember the time, blah, blah, blah. And for us, it's, yeah, remember the time Shayna got drunk on the boat.
Mhm.
Because I was such a strict parent, my children assumed she was 21 when she got drunk because mom doesn't allow drinking for anybody who's not 21.
Mhm.
The thing is, Shayna was 5 years old and almost drowned when she got drunk on the boat. And once my children realized that, they understood me and why I was so strict around certain things. And it wasn't just drinking and alcohol that I was strict about. So I was controlling in certain ways that my father was also controlling. And I didn't want to be that way, but I was passing the same trauma on to my kids. I was different, but it was the same thread pulling down through another generation. And now we've wound some of that back, and hopefully my children are aware now and they will do more healing and then they won't pass it on to their kids.
How do you get that conversation started? What do you wish that
Mm.
veterans would know from a kid's point of view? Because you were the kid. What do you wish that maybe your dad would have known before? Because eventually you got there, but what would you wish that he would have understood before then?
My dad actually came to me when he was 89 and visited me in my home and asked if we had any issues to clear up. And we had a lot of issues. But I wanted to hear about the war because I thought to myself, that's where our issues started. But I also thought, I'm not going to open up and be vulnerable to you. You go first. And so the way you start and have a deep conversation is to open and be vulnerable. And I often start conversations with, we don't like the word vulnerability. We think it's weak or trendy or whatever. But the truth of it is, you've got to lay yourself out there to be slayed. That is what vulnerability is. And it takes a lot of courage to do it. And the way I start with my kids is to say, I want to talk to you about something, and I've never done it before, and I don't know how to do it. So it might come out sideways, it might come out messy, but I'm going to try. So please bear with me. And that just opens it up to, okay, mom is trying. Mom wants to say something, she doesn't know how to do it. And I think that is a great entrance point into it, into a
Yeah.
conversation.
Into
Is
that.
just to admit, I don't know how to do this and I'm afraid to do it, but I'm going to try anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And the first breakthroughs there are somebody's got to initiate it. And more than
Yep.
likely, the veteran is not going to be the one. And it's not that we don't want to. I wanted to be better, but I didn't even know I had an issue. So there was that. I had to figure out that I had an issue. And when I figured out I had an issue and that it was affecting my life and my family and such, then I was able to address it. I know that, drug addicts go through the same thing, but it was true. I know I had a problem when I found out I had a problem, and then I had to actually go address them. But my kids, unfortunately, they're older and they went through that and they carry some of that. And that is, I don't have many regrets in life, but that one's a big one that
Well,
they'll have that.
Yeah, you said that the veteran probably isn't going to be the one, but I'm not going to let the veterans off the hook here because the kids aren't going to be the ones either because
Right.
they have been trained into silence. And I know my dad's not going to talk about this. I've
Hmm.
tried too many times to talk to him. I've seen other people try to talk to him. He does not talk about this, and I do not want his wrath. So I think both the veteran and the child, whoever you are, it doesn't matter. You've got to make the effort. If you
Thank you.
want to make change, you have to make the effort.
Thank you so much for correcting me on that. I want to show you guys her webpage, BeckyEllis.net. I've been scrolling it through, but she has, you can order the book. I listen to Audible, Amazon. I highly recommend her book. And she's got other stuff that she's written as well. I highly recommend you go through and look at this. It was a very personal, and it was a personal spotlight because I was him. Maybe not in the same way, but I was him. And there's a lot of us as dads who realize, shit, I I, I did damage, and shit, I did the same damage as my dad, and I'm sorry, but I'm sorry I did that, but it happened. And then you read a story like this, and that is coming from the kid, and you're like, my kid could probably write something similar, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I really love that you came on. I hope I could have you on again because I know there's so much more we can dig on. But on my show, my guest always has the last word. So I'll shut up and let you speak.
Oh, that's so nice of you. If you go back to that website, there's a tab called Connect, and there's a way for people to reach out to me. And I always love to hear how the book landed on them or if they have questions. There's also a spot down there where I've had so many people ask me, if you scroll down, people have said, right, yeah, a little bit more. Right there. People have said, how do you start a conversation? The same thing you ask. So many people have asked that. I have there 10 tips to create more connective conversations, and it walks people through. Here's a way to do that. And people can email me there. I love hearing about how the book impacted people, and um, I offer help in any way I can because I really believe you know, I really believe we need much more awareness on the sacrifice of veterans, whether civilians become more aware or veterans themselves feel validated because they hear someone say, I know you sacrificed your whole life, not just a couple of years. So
Yeah,
thank you. And thank you
I
for
said
your service and
I
sacrifice.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. I said I wasn't gonna cry on this one, man. Those gates are a lot easier to crack nowadays. Now that I'm on the other side of the tunnel, and I'm okay with it. I don't want to flood out all the time. But can you stick around real quick after the show?
You bet.
Thank you.